Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I am your host, Dr. Nick, and this is the 90s Guy Show. Now, I recently got a video request to do from a viewer named Yard Sale Hunter. He wanted me to do a video on the Nintendo Game Boy and how it affected the 90s and gaming in general. Now, we all know of the current generation of the Nintendo Game Boy 3DS, the 2DS. Then, of course, you got the big Nintendo system, the Wii U. Now, it all started in 1980 with the Nintendo Game & Watch series, which basically they look like today's 3DSs, except they were on LCD screens and they had a clock or an alarm, and it was a very simplified LCD games. You had Donkey Kong Jr., you had, I believe, a baseball game. There was also, I believe there was some type of casino game. Very simplified, very interesting concept, of course, and it actually inspired Nintendo to make the Game Boy. Now, let me give you a little bit of a history of, the Game Boy in general and sort of what it was running up against. Now, the Game Boy came out in July 31st, 1989, and there was, by the end of its cycle, there was about 1,000 games. It competed with the Turbo Express, Atari Lynx, the Sega Game Gear, and by the end of its run, it sold over 120 million units. It came with pack-in games such as Tetris, Baseball, Super Mario Land, and it was an awesome system. I own one. A lot of people were, really intrigued by the fact that you could play games on the go. Now, it took 4 AA batteries, and it relatively had a pretty good battery life for the most part. But it was interesting because of the fact that you could play video games on the go, as opposed to sitting at home and playing video games. You could take it with you in the car, on trips. You can, play it even in the same room as someone who's playing the system. You could be playing on the handheld. Of course, the color was in black and green, or as they call it, some of them call it the pea soup color. But it was an interesting system. It was one of those things that I don't think Nintendo knew exactly how well it would be received by the public, but it was received big time, huge. So let me give you a little bit of an idea of sort of the history. In '95, they came out what they called the Play It Loud series, which was green, red, yellow, blue, and the white was apparently an exclusive to United Kingdom Toys R Us stores. They also came out with a Manchester United Red, which was also a very rare Game Boy. Now, these were colored Game Boys, but the actual screens were not colored yet. That did not come out until 1998, when they actually came out with the Game Boy Colors. They had a color screen, but they had no backlit for the screens. The games that came with that were Wario Land 2, Tetris DX, Pocket Bomberman, and of course, they made famous the Pokemon series. The Pokemon Gold and Silver, of course, were the biggest selling games of the Pokemon series. They also had special colors: berry, grape, kiwi, dandelion, teal. They sold over 42 million. Now, you're asking yourself, wow, that's huge. Would you, like, in a way, a lot of people thought that the Game Gear, the Sega Game Gear, would have given Nintendo a run for its money. But let me give you a little bit of an insight on the Sega side of this. The Nomad came out in '95. Now, before that, the Sega Game Gear came out in 1992. They sold 10 million units, color backlit screen, short battery life. And here's why the battery life sucks so much. Because the internal components were pretty much similar to the Sega Master System, believe it or not. Now, a lot of people may or may not know that. The other problem is they didn't really have that big of a library. They only had about 300 games for the system itself. They were also focusing on the Sega CD and the 32X at the time. So Sega did not really support the Game Gear. And as much as they tried, they could not surpass the Game Boy, owned by Nintendo. It just wasn't happening. I remember during the campaigns that were going back and forth, they talked about the fact that, we have a color screen, we have color graphics, faster processor, stuff like that. And they, basically said, about Nintendo's Game Boy, having no color, that, anybody that had an IQ of less than 12 would be happy with no color screen. And of course, Nintendo lashed back and basically said that they were making fun of people who had a mental or learning disability, which they kind of were. If you really think about it, that campaign was kind of crossing the line, in my opinion. But, you may think that, especially during that time, I think they were just wanting to be edgy. Sega's idea of gaming was edgy because if you think about it, on the Genesis, the games were more edgy. They were more for adults. They had a lot of adult content versus Nintendo family-friendly games. Now, here's what's really interesting about the Nomad, which to this day they said that they weren't replacing the Game Gear with the Nomad, but I don't know. In 1995, the Sega Nomad came out, originally made for the airlines in Japan. You could play the Sega Genesis games. And then in other countries, it was known as the Sega Master System. But anyways, at the time, they were focusing on the Genesis, the Game Gear, and the Saturn. Also, the Sega Pico. So there was many things going on with Sega, and I just don't think they were realizing what exactly was going on. There was just so much stuff. There was lots of add-ons for all these different handheld systems. The Game Boy will always be revolutionary in the handheld system, no matter what anybody says. Now, I was a fan of the Game Gear. I actually had a Game Gear. I had Shinobi. I had Sonic the Hedgehog. I had a bunch of the WWF wrestling games. I loved it. I personally did not own a Game Boy. I actually got a Game Boy Color about 3 years ago. And I have to admit, the games are pretty fun. But I got a Game Gear because it had a color screen. The graphics were much better. But as we all know, and then in the the gaming community, just because the graphics are better does not make it a great game. We all know this. So, I guess in a way, the Game Boy revolutionized the future of handheld gaming in the 90s and so on. They had the Game Boy Pocket, which was a smaller version. It was interesting because of the fact that it was something that was different in design. It was only released in Japan, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I could be wrong. But it was interesting to me because they were so innovative with changing the designs. The design for the Game Gear, on the other hand, they believed that because it was similar to holding a Genesis controller, it would be easier and more natural for a gamer to use. But anyways, this is just a brief history of all the different handheld systems. I hope this video answered a lot of people's questions. If you'd like me to do other videos like this, I would be glad to. Check all these different systems out. Go to your retro game stores. See if you can get them cheap on eBay, stuff like that. I'm not really a handheld gamer person. I've always been mostly console based. But, to each their own. There are a lot of good games. The only game I played on the Nintendo DS, which was, I believe, the new Mario World, the new Super Mario, that was the only game I played on it. I haven't played anything other than that. I've been mostly just console based: Genesis, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, games like that. I was never into the Pokemon series. Not bashing it or anything, but it just wasn't for me. I wasn't interested in it. I was by that time when those games came out. They came out in 1998. I was in seventh grade, so by that time it missed my generation, so to speak. I turned 31 last Saturday, or not last Saturday, the Saturday before, and it just missed my generation. So it wasn't something that I was interested in playing or even being involved in. So I was more about the Sonic the Hedgehog and NBA Jam and a lot of those types of games. And then of course, PlayStation came along. But anyways, like this video, subscribe for more, and I will see you all later.